welcome to Talks at Google. My name is Ida Shen, and I'm a food program manager for the Food at Google program. Today, I'd like to introduce you to Kate Leahy, who's going to be our guest. Kate has written or edited over 10 books on food and wine, including the A16 Food and Wine, an IACP, and for those of you who aren't in the know, that's the International Association of Culinary Professionals Cookbook of the Year and winner of the Julia Child Best First Book Award. Prior to writing, Kate spent 5 years cooking on the line at various James Beard award-winning restaurants in California and Boston. Kate is joining us today to discuss her latest cookbook, La Buvette, Recipes and Wine Notes from Paris, which was released on July 7th and co-authored with proprietor Camille Fourmont. So welcome, Kate.
Thank you for having me, Ida. It's good to see your face. I'm just sorry that I'm not in your beautiful kitchen at the Google campus.
Oh, I wish we were there so that you could do amazing demos like you do. Kate has the amazing ability to speak and cook at the exact same time without chopping off fingers. So,
well, yes. So, fortunately, don't worry, everyone. I'm not using knives during this.
So today we'll have a great little special where Kate's going to demo a dish from her book. So stay on to the end of this talk. So let's just get into some questions about your newest book. And which is most interesting is that you are based in San Francisco, and correct. Yet you you collaborated with the proprietor La Buvette in Paris. Could you talk about how you got to Paris and how this came about?
You know, it's a really it's a good question because it's not an obvious fit. I'm a Californian. I don't speak French, which is really embarrassing. So I pronounce everything incorrectly. But I had written books with 10 Speed Press, and they really wanted to work with Camille. And just a little bit about who Camille Fourmont is. And if get a closer look of the book. So this charming picture is basically a snapshot of what it's like in La Buvette. It's a postage size, like a little wine shop in Paris in the 11th arrondissement. People just call it the 11th. And what makes it so special is that it's a place where people can go just for a glass of wine. They can go before dinner, or they can hang out all night. But the key difference between what La Buvette is and what, say, a restaurant or a bar is that anyone who gets a glass of wine also has to get something to eat. But the catch is there's no kitchen. She doesn't have a kitchen. The shop she took over was a 1930s dairy, kind of like what they would say a crèmerie. So it's something that you would go, to buy milk and cheese and other dairy products. But it's got this just so much charm to it. So when she found the space in, I think it was 2012, she could imagine a wine shop there. And that's why it's called a cave à manger. It's a wine shop for eating because you can stay and have a glass of wine as long as you have a little plate of food. And she comes up with very clever ways to make food when you don't have a kitchen.
The cave à manger is kind of a new concept for me and Americans. Is this something new for the Parisians as well, or has this been a long-standing type of wine shop?
It's actually, I don't know how long it's been happening. I mean, I'm sure there's versions of cave à manger that have gone back for hundreds of years, but it's actually this specific type of a cave à manger is a relatively new thing. Starting maybe in the 2000s, there was this real movement toward natural wine in Paris in general. But the key to get people to try the wine is you wanted a shop to sell it. But you had to convince people that they would want to buy it. And you couldn't do that by just pouring a glass of wine for them. You had to say, okay, because the law says if you're a wine shop, you can't pour wine unless somebody orders something to eat. So they all these little wine shops that primarily just sought out to sell wine ended up finding kind of clever ways to also serve food. And it's really something, it's a starting in 2000, it just sort of starts slowly building. And now the joke is, I always I'd be going around Paris and I'd ask Camille, I said, okay, so is that a cave à manger, or is that a restaurant, or is that a bar, or what is that? And now there's so much blurring of the definitive terms of what a cave à manger is, but the definition really is a wine shop for eating. And I would say this iteration of what La Buvette is a pretty new idea, and it's something that I hope just spreads. I mean, I want cave à mangers all over the place. They're just really great things when you don't want to necessarily dedicate to a whole meal at an establishment. Maybe you just want to meet a friend, have your glass of wine, a plate of delicious, maybe a little cheese, charcuterie, or as we're going to demonstrate today, beans, and then go on your day. But I'll go back to the original question about why me? Why was I the lucky one who got to work on this project? And it goes back to my time working with 10 Speed. I had worked on, just sort of by happenstance, my first book being A16 Food and Wine. I wasn't a wine writer, but I got thrown in the deep end of learning about Southern Italian wine. And then several years later, I ended up helping Peter Liam, who is an expert on Champagne, sort of put together his sort of opus on Champagne. So I started just by working with expert in the wine field, learning more about wine. And from that, 10 Speed, when they were trying to find who can do recipes for a cookbook, but also has a wine background, they thought of me. And so, but another part of this working with other, having a team do a book is that it's a little bit like matchmaking or making new friends. You have to make sure you get along. So before, I think when we were working on the proposal, we must have spent several hours on the phone, just getting to know each other, me trying to understand Camille's story. You have to, when you work as a co-author and writing in somebody else's voice, you have to get their trust. And it takes a long time. I mean, it's sort of like by the time you get 3/4 the way through the manuscript, you're like, okay, we're good. We've got a working style. We know what we need to say. So it's
you must be really good at that, because you've co-authored in quite a few books for people, Burma Superstar, and I didn't know this until I looked on your website, but the Ayesha Curry book as well. So it's understanding and gaining the trust of people so that you can speak in their voice, right?
Right. And that is a tricky thing. You kind of have to be a little bit of a chameleon. So if I have to take myself out of it and think, what would Camille say in this instance? And that really comes with spending time talking with them, spending time in person. I have to say I'm really lucky that we worked on this book starting 2018 through 2019. And I had maybe about 3 trips to Paris where it was pretty intensive, hit the ground running every single day, running around with Camille to the places she goes in Paris, spending hours just sitting in La Buvette, watching the kind of the choreography of Parisians hanging out and looking much cooler than me, drinking their wine and having these little small bites. And it was a lot of fun. It was a lot of intense work. It was sort of being part of a very small production where you're a two-person team. But I also had to learn how to ride on the back of a Vespa in Paris and hold on. And that was another, adventure. So there were definitely adventures to be had.
That sounds like a lot of fun. A little harrowing, perhaps, but really fun. So were there any challenges to working with that language barrier? And in particular, any kind of challenges where it relates to French styles of cooking or wine drinking and preparation?
I think the biggest challenge was it would take a while for me to sort of understand a very simple point. One funny anecdote is that Camille was explaining to me how she ended up making this one recipe. What she does is she takes smoked tuna and slices the smoked tuna and puts it on a plate, sprinkles some sea salt, and puts the pulp of pomelo, those huge citrus, and you can pull out the pulp and sprinkle it on top. And it's like you get these little bursts of citrus flavor. And the reason she came up with that idea is she kept telling me about citron caviar. And I'm thinking, oh, so is she juicing like citrus and then getting a little eyedropper and then putting it in a bowl so it seizes up and becomes like molecular gastronomy, little like encapsulated citrus juice? That's what I was thinking when I thought citrus caviar. I was completely wrong. And this took months of her explaining to me, and I'd go back and I said, but don't you really mean this? And she's like, no. And finally, I think we were talking, and I was in Paris at the time, and I realized I think we saw the produce in front of us, and she's like, citron caviar. And I thought, we call those finger limes. And that doesn't make any sense why we call it finger limes and she calls it citron caviar. I mean, it is like caviar. And if anyone's never seen this type of citrus before, it is really cool. They do grow it now, I think, in Southern California. I think it's primarily in Australia, though. But
Australia and New Zealand. But yeah. For those of you who are in the Bay Area, it's coming up. I've seen it at a couple of nurseries. And they come in two colors, right? Pink and white. So it's an amazing
Do you use it? Do you use it, Ida, in certain things?
Well, my tree hasn't borne any fruit yet, but I'm hoping.
Oh, but you have a tree.
Yeah, yeah. It's amazing because, like, on top of oysters is amazing, and just even in salads because it's like a little burst. So for those of you, the reason why it's caviar, the areoles are separate from each other so that you can squeeze the fruit and you get like little tiny droplets of citrus goodness.
Right, it's just like this burst, and Camille loves that type of citrus, but in Paris it's very expensive. So she thought, what could she use that would kind of emulate a finger lime and like that burst of juice you get? So she took it to the getting a big pomelo and then separating out those little kind of the pulp in the pomelo and then sprinkling it on top. So that would be an example of a dish that you can prepare that does not require a kitchen. But you can serve it, and it's kind of like it has that wow restaurant feeling with only needing a few ingredients. Of course, some sort of smoked fish. It wouldn't have to be the smoked tuna she buys. Although, if you one day when you go to Paris, you can visit La Buvette and try that smoked tuna because it is quite delicious.
It's amazing. So what I found interesting from your book was that Camille is not a trained chef, and but has amazing thoughts on food, like her taste profiles. How does she develop that?
That's a question I asked her over and over again to try to get a sense. And I think for her, it was almost, she doesn't want herself to sound like, oh, I'm this genius, this culinary genius, and I just find these flavors come to me. But in a way, that's kind of what happens. I mean, she will have an idea. Maybe she's in a market, or maybe she's remembering two flavors she's had before. In the book, she talks about going to this incredible spice shop and smelling things and having like a moment where she's thinking, what if I connected it to this flavor? And she says it doesn't always work, but it allows her to sort of be free. And you have enough successes over time that you develop sort of a flavor and sensory memory for things. But Ida, one of the amazing things about how she's developed her palate is when she was in school, when she was maybe 9 or 10 years old, they had something in school called Taste Week, and so every sort of school kid in France has to go through this every day at school, you're learning about flavor and taste and how to identify like a really good tomato from one that's just not maybe industrially produced. Like, leave it to the French to have a way to make sure their children grow up with incredible palates to be able to appreciate their beautiful cheeses and produce. So maybe she had an advantage just growing up in France. I don't know.
Yeah, and I think she even mentioned how she and her brother would continue Taste Week by having their own little tasting sessions with food, blindfolded.
Right, and that's actually, yeah, I mean, think of it, if people out there want to sort of develop their palate, and maybe if you've watched Top Chef, you've seen this challenge, but picture just blindfold yourself and maybe have someone there helping you, but kind of then taste, just have something and taste it and try to think, what am I tasting? Is this an olive or is this a caper? and if you taste it, it's amazing how much more difficult it is to identify flavors when you can't see them. But that way you can kind of imprint these flavors and these aromas to your brain in a way that you don't have to when you can see them in person.
So then that kind of correlates to her wine as well, right? To pair the food with the wine.
And I think it does. I think more so, though, it's about her identifying wines she likes and not being afraid to just go with it. Whether it's one thing that's happened in Paris and in New York and probably San Francisco, LA, places that have these natural wine communities, there's a little bit of ego that's getting involved. That's sort of frustrating for people who have been in the natural wine world for a while. And the ego comes into just liking a wine because somebody else who might be really popular says it's cool, and not really thinking to yourself, well, do I actually like this wine? Is this a good wine for me? Maybe it's a good wine for other people, but is this something that I really like? And I think by trusting your palate and knowing that maybe it's kind of contradictory, because it's two things. You want to trust your palate, but you also want to be open to try new things. So, but I think for her, she can trust her palate in her shop to pick out. She doesn't have a huge selection of wines. And that's something we can talk about too, just the difference of what it's like to drink wine in a wine shop in Paris than it is maybe in a restaurant in the US. But she doesn't have a lot of wines. Her wines are almost like she's a cheesemonger, and she knows which wines are tasting good at a certain time. So she'll only have a certain amount poured by the glass, or you could buy the bottle, and she can put, faith in that these wines taste great. If someone tastes them and it's not for them, she says that's fine. She'll, adjust and pour something else, but she can stand behind all the wine she pours. And the difference is when you're pouring wine in Paris, and this is something that's great and freeing if you're intimidated by wine lists. You can just go and say, and she'll ask you, like, what are you in the mood for? Are you in the mood for something white, something sparkly, and something red, something in between, into something's a little bit of a surprise? And then she'll have a little dialogue with you. So then she can think, okay, well, try this and see if that's something you want. Rather than sort of wading through a wine list that might be unfamiliar, it might have producers you don't know. You can just trust her to help guide you and drink it. So I think it's more interactive. I have to say, a lot of Americans are more used to sitting down at a table, looking at a list and pointing to something and not wanting to have that interaction. But that's very un-Parisian. The Parisians want to have a dialogue with you. They want to say hello when you walk into their shop. They want to say goodbye when you walk out. They don't want you to just sit down, ignore them, and then order something. So it's still a different.
Oh, I like how it's a curated experience for you, because taste is subjective, right? And I think that's that was something I took away from the book, was to trust your own palate, and your palate may not be the same as somebody else's.
And it's okay if your palate changes over time too. I mean, it might be something where you're going through a phase and you only want to drink red wine from a certain area, but eventually you might change. And it's always just recognizing what you like, but also what else is out there, and not just following a trend just because other people are saying this is what you should be drinking or eating.
I have a question regarding the label natural wine. Is it organic, or is there room for interpretation?
And this is what's going to get me in a lot of trouble, because no one, there's just now, you can't really, there's so much that people, there's a lot of controversies on what exactly is natural wine, because some people on one side will argue it's grapes and you're making a beverage from grapes. What's not natural about it? But then there's the other side. It says, yeah, but you're adding things in the process, or you're taking things away from the process. So the simplest way I can describe natural wine is that it's wine that's made with nothing added and nothing taken away. And within that definition, there's so much gray area. But just to keep it very simple, it tends to be a wine that's grapes that have been farmed organically. However, there's no need for a certified organic label. So that's another layer of the gray field that I was talking about. So, but the biggest thing to remember when it comes to natural wine, I think, is the size of the production. These are small, handcrafted wines. They can't be made in a large scale because they don't have those the safety net of technology to kind of guide a wine in the right delicious direction. And bigger wineries tend to need more control. They need more, whether that's filtering wine, adding things to the wine to stabilize them. Lots of very big commercial wineries do these kinds of things. And this movement to natural wine was a break from that, wanting to get back to the very essence of what wine's been for thousands of years. But within there, like I said, there's definitely gray area. A lot of people who sort of are billed as natural wine producers do use a little sulfur at the end when they're bottling. And sulfur naturally occurs in wine and in the winemaking process, but a tiny bit added before bottling also can kind of keep that wine so that when it's shipped and stocked at a wine shop in San Francisco after it's left Paris or Italy or wherever it's come from, it has a better chance of being stable. It won't have, because there's a lot of volatility with natural wine. And some people, they like that. And in France, I mean, there's this one woman, she kept going, volatile. Like that was like, oh, I cannot stand the wines that are volatile. And other people find it more exciting to drink wines that are changing in the bottle. So I don't know if I've cleared up your answer or your question, but it's definitely a place where tread carefully. There's lots of people out there who say it's one way or another way completely. But Eric Asimoff in the New York Times, the wine columnist for the New York Times, has some great columns about natural wine. And his takeaway, which I agree with, is that whether you agree with the movement or not, it's made wine overall better because all producers have had to really focus on how they're making wine in a more kind of conscientious way.
Thank you. I never knew that much about, I just drank the wine, but I never thought about how it could have so much gray area and the volatility of it. Wine goes bad, but now you're making me think it's a living product in a bottle. So I have a question regarding the timing of your cookbooks. So were you almost done with production by the time we had to shelter in place, or did you have to continue writing separated?
Well, fortunately, we were basically going through, the book had already been, I believe the book had been shipped to the printer before we had shelter in place orders, which was really fortunate because at least we could get our files to the printer. And the big challenge was it took a lot longer for the books to come back to the US. Most full color cookbooks are printed in China and then shipped over. It's very rare these days to find a book that's printed in color that's actually produced domestically. So you would get the books months in advance of the launch, but I think it was maybe 3 weeks before the book officially hit the market that I got my first copy. So, but I mean, that's such a minor thing compared to a lot of authors. If I had been in the middle of trying to organize a photo shoot in Paris when all of this happened, that would have been a lot more challenging, especially because you wouldn't be able to capture the images that we have in the book, where we hope that you can open the book and feel like you're maybe walking through parts of Paris, the east side of Paris, where Camille's shop is, and where a lot of the people we talk to in the book, where their businesses are, where they live.
Yeah, and it must have. I don't know how to phrase this. Sorry.
No worries. I know.
Those challenges, on top of the fact that let's just say you're writing a new book right now, right? So the launch of the book happened. Promotion of going on a book tour and such must have completely changed, right? And then, so it's 2 parts. And then the other is you're working on a new book now. And are you making changes to how you are writing this new book and your long-term plans?
I am making changes. I think one of the things that was really challenging is I'm writing a book that's it's about sort of easy, small plates of food or dishes that you can make and pair nicely with wine. It's not a strict wine pairing book, but it's a great place to sort of just kind of continue your exploration of like learning more about the food you like with the wines you like and making a little adventure of it. The idea kind of came about some of I'm still friends. I'm fortunate. I still have this great group of friends from high school. And I was thinking about it. Camille has this group of people who used to come into La Bouvette every Wednesday, and they were like the Wednesday Club. And they were just, I met them, and they're just like delightful people, all really fascinating fields of work. But my group of high school friends, we were the porch time group. And the joke was none of us had porches. But when we all sort of ended up back in the San Francisco Bay Area, we would just get together and just have really simple food with wine, nothing too expensive, just kind of what was good that sort of helped us catch up and have a good conversation, but also was delicious. And so the book I'm writing is called Wine Style, and it's just basically find your wine style through these like very simple, delicious recipes. So thinking about writing this book, I'm thinking, well, I don't know when I'm going to be able to have another porch time. And the challenge also was thinking about how am I going to get the ingredients? This was, I think, back in March, we didn't know if, how often can you go to the grocery store? Should you avoid the grocery store? These ingredients that were out of stock. Fortunately, I already had stocked up on toilet paper, so I didn't have that issue. Like so many people were frantically worried about, getting their Costco supply of toilet paper. I was worried about can I get chickpea flour? Is chickpea flour too niche? Should I think of this recipe in a different way to make it more accessible? So just really editing myself to think, can I cross off an ingredient? Do I need red pepper flakes, or just leave it as an option if people have it? So thinking through, is this something that can be made in a small quantity in case maybe it's just two people who are having a picnic together, or maybe it's just you and your partner, your spouse just getting together and watching Netflix? Are you going to want this bowl of popcorn together? So it did really force me to think through and edit myself. And I'm hoping the end result when the book comes out next year is that the book will have a long lifespan, not only for times where we might not be able to hang out in groups, but also in a way that the recipes will work. They'll be reliable. They'll have a quality where you don't feel like you have to invest in anything incredibly expensive or new to have really tasty kind of results in your own kitchen. So that's the goal. And so I'm feeling actually good about it. But the crazy thing was, I had to think about doing a photo shoot for the cookbook in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we had to do it. We did our photo shoot in I think it was June, and the way they did it was the photographer, she was working exclusively with a food stylist in Berkeley, so they had already been working with other clients. But in normal situations, I would have been able to go to the shoot, and they had to just keep that bubble closed. And I would just get calls every day from Lily and King, the food stylist, and Aaron Scott every day would send images as they were working on the shoot, and they just did an amazing job. And some of the things, there was one recipe, it was for a sort of focaccia, but a sweet kind of focaccia with fruit on top. And my idea was having grapes on top, but the grapes, I did a version in my kitchen and it tasted really good, but visually the grapes kind of made it look like it had chicken pox. And I think it was because our brains were on coronavirus. So we thought, okay. So Lily and Kang said, can I use cherries? So she had these beautiful kind of arrangement of cherries on this focaccia. And that made me think, well, if she can use cherries, can I have sliced peaches? What about fresh figs? Why did I have to stick just with grapes? So that recipe evolved through this working under maybe more restrictions, but you can find, sometimes I think it's easier to be creative when you have parameters than when people give you carte blanche to say, hey, write a book about wine and food. So it's been an adventure.
It sounds like an adventure. So did you have to throw back any of those photos and say, no, please do that one again since you weren't there?
I, I, I didn't have the heart to even want to do, because they were working so hard and so well. And it's such a pro team that I thought I would rather give them creative license to have fun and see what they came up with. So I gave them sort of loose guidelines, and they sent me props and everything. And then I said, you know what? We're just going to let them run with it. And I was definitely just blown away by what they did come up with. So sometimes I think that's one of the things I love working on cookbooks. It doesn't have to be, sometimes it feels isolating to work on any kind of writing project. Writing itself is an isolating activity. But with cookbooks, there's layers of people involved. You have a relationship with your editor. You have a relationship with the photographer and the food stylist, if there's a food stylist, or in Camille's case, Camille was the food stylist. We were very fortunate to work with Marcus Nielsen, and Camille and Marcus just had this amazing way of thinking visually. And I just absorbed what they were doing, stood back and watched them kind of put the book, give the book life with photography. So cookbooks can be collaborative, and that also might be why I've done so many collaborations versus solely working on my own work. It's fun to kind of do your own project, but it's also fun to just be part of a team.
Thank you. And, thanks for sharing some insight into writing cookbooks. You've written quite a few, and I was just wondering, are there any tips for those of you who might be like all of a sudden interested in creating a book of your own, or even for your loved ones, right? They're people who create their self-publish. Do you have any tips as to how to write a cookbook? Because I think people are really taking an interest in food and recipes, and I know I'm reaching out to my family members for their recipes so that I can recreate them at home. So maybe family cookbooks might be in people's future.
That's a really good point. Creating your own sort of your own family cookbook that then you can share with the next generations, I think, is incredibly important. And one of the things to think about, don't get so hung up on, especially if you are just getting started. The most important thing is really thinking through your recipes, making sure you have the ingredients written in a clear manner and the steps written very clearly. And there is a bit of a language and rhythm. I think people who are financial journalists, they get into a rhythm when they're reporting, what's going on in the stock market. The same thing happens with recipes. When you do it over and over again, you intuitively know that you're supposed to tell people to simmer this for 1 to 3 minutes, or until it is reduced to the point that it coats the back of a spoon. That doesn't come easily to first-time recipe writers or even cookbook authors. And I would have to say that when A16 being my first project, I mean, that was trial by fire. And I have to say that at the time I was working for a restaurant trade magazine that gave that I met Ida through, and it was I was reporting on what was going on in the restaurant industry during the day. And then I would either wake up really early in the morning or on weekends work on A16. And I didn't know how to write recipes because I knew I was learning how to write and report, but that didn't teach me, the order of ingredients, how you write out ingredients. So I would look at books I admired and I would see how they did it. And I said, okay, that's interesting. They put all the ingredients in the order that the ingredients are used in the recipe. That's what I should do too. So if the first thing you do is you season the chicken with salt and pepper, you might write, the chicken is the first item. And you don't just say chicken, you say, is it a thigh? Is it a chicken breast? Is it the whole chicken? If it's the whole chicken, how many pounds does it weigh, or grams? Is it a 3 to 4 pound frying chicken? All those little details really help people so that when you're at the grocery store, you're thinking, they said chicken, but I don't know how large of a chicken, I don't know what size of a chicken. So if chicken maybe is the first thing, maybe you're putting the chicken on the cutting board and you're pounding it. So chicken's your first ingredient. Then maybe you're seasoning it with salt and pepper. Those are your next 2 ingredients. Then you're putting some olive oil on it, your next ingredient. So you can work through and just think, okay, what would help somebody who's trying to follow my recipe? And again, like I just looked at cookbooks by people I admire to see what style that they used. And then you start emulating it. And then you get your own style the more you go. And that also makes it a little bit more personal. But I should say, let me give you guys a real simple demonstration of a recipe that's really not a recipe. Does that sound good?
That sounds awesome. We would love that. And this is in La Buvette as well, right?
This is La Buvette. Let me just get the page. These are, oops, wrong. Okay. This is a Camille's. It's the joke.
Famous, right?
They're famous because how can beans truly be famous? But let me just, I'm going to do a little magic with my camera. All right. So, perfect. Can beans truly be famous? Well, that's up for debate. But the thing is, this dish is so simple, but people come to La Buvette for years. They would come for these, she calls them, they're giant beans with citrus zest. So you can see these beans are really, really large. Certain beans you can look for are gigante beans. Those are probably large Corona beans. These are actually Corona beans. These are butter beans, and they're a little bit smaller, but these will also work. And literally what this is the can of butter beans. You just open it, rinse it off, and it's ready to go. The Corona beans came from Italy in this really cute jar, but let's see. So
are there other beans that you can use? I noticed that these 2 are both white beans.
I think that you could use, I think that the most important thing is they're sort of mild beans that are creamy. I really love black beans, but I feel like black beans might be, they might lose some of the subtle flavorings. I would say like these beans, these are just cannellini beans. Those are going to be smaller, but the flavor I think will work really well with this recipe. So, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take some just really nice olive oil, the kind that you drizzle, the kind that you really want to taste, and I'm going to give these beans this nice glossy finish.
Like a bath.
I mean, go generous,
Yeah.
And then you could always serve this with bread, so you can dip the sauce in. Next, I'm going to take, this is a sour orange. You can use so many different types of citrus. I think the most important thing is really good quality citrus where you want to taste the peel. So Ida, do you have certain favorite citrus that you would, that you'd want to try out on this? A good Eureka lemon is also perfect for it.
Right. I mean, I was just wondering, because this actually goes to one of our questions, the finger lime. Somebody was asking me what your finger lime recipes are, and I was just wondering, would that be something that we could put on top of this recipe, or would that be too much?
I would save the finger limes for probably raw fish, because that juiciness with the raw flesh of fish, or even in like a salad with fruit might be a better kind of application. Here, I think the zest is just what you need. So the texture of the beans is what you're really experiencing, the creaminess of it. But I mean, I've never tried it, so it might be delicious. Here's this is just like a little bit of Malden sea salt flakes, just a little bit on top. And I mean, if you want to get fancy, you could serve it with toothpicks, So, and then you just kind of eat it by the toothpick, or you just, use a fork. I'll just do it one more quick time so you get a sense of like how easy this recipe is and how it's so silly. Like Camille's she's like, I tried to take it off the menu, but then people are always asking like, where are the beans?
Well, it looks so refreshing, especially now that we're in the summer. And for those of us who are in California, we just had this huge heat wave. It looks like you could easily make this into a whole meal, right?
Right.
With the addition of, say, like you were saying, some fish, like a smoked tuna, if we could find that, or even just on top of toast.
Yes, I think if you have any of that olive oil packed tuna, having that with the beans, I think that would be a great kind of addition. And this time of year you get such great tomatoes. So you could also do something, maybe bruschetta with some with tomatoes, some with the beans. But this is the simplest thing.
That took you less than 30 seconds to put on the plate.
It's literally beans on a plate. And so the thing is, you don't have to use beans from a can. You can use, you can cook your own beans if you're feeling, especially if you love beans. And the joke is, I guess the last time I did a Talks at Google, I also did a bean demonstration, which now, next I'm just going to have to keep going with this bean trend, I guess.
You have to just make that your signature dish. But those were delicious beans as well. Speaking of beans and cooking your own beans, do you have a favorite way of cooking? Do you soak them the night before, or is there a way of, if you forget, can you cook the beans the day of?
I'm a fan of soaking the beans and then draining the beans and then cooking them with fresh water. If I don't have time to soak the beans, I will do like the quick method where I put beans and water together and then I bring the pot to a boil and then I let it sit for an hour, drain it, and then I'll cook the beans. That might be fussy for folks. It is fine to just cook beans dry all the way through. I just feel I get better results, better texture. Some people say it's more digestible to soak beans and then drain the beans and then cook them. I don't know. Ida, what are your thoughts on it? How do you like to cook beans?
I also like to soak the night before, drain, and all of that. But in a pinch, I've been using my Instant Pot. And it has helped because sometimes I'm not that great at my mise en place. But without the Instant Pot, it's the soak and drain. And I have found the Chamba pots to really just do an amazing job of creating tender, delicious beans.
Oh, that's a great idea. I'm going to try that.
Yeah. So for those of you who don't know, Chamba's it's a Colombian, I believe, earthenware pot. So it's just like earthenware cooking, and it's a slower simmering temperature, right?
So it's gentler on the beans. I think one of the big disappointments you can have is you buy these beans and you cook them and they fall apart. And that's such a bummer. Sometimes that's just the beans are old, right? I did like sometimes the beans just weren't, maybe they were past their prime, even though that, dried beans don't necessarily go bad. There is a point where they're maybe too dry and they just become brittle. If you do cook beans though, maybe your Instant Pot setting was off or you just simmered them too long. Just mash them, and that's also quite delicious. An Italian version of refried beans that we had in the A16 book was you cook cannellini beans, and then you have this slick of olive oil in the pan, sort of like what I was just showing with the bean demo. A slick of olive oil, you put some garlic and fresh marjoram, add the cannellini beans, and then you're kind of like frying them, but mashing them as you're cooking them. And then you add some of the bean cooking liquid, which is just amazing to have for vegetarian soups and stocks. And you end up with this really rich, creamy sort of cannellini bean. It just looks like the simplest food, but it was when I worked as a line cook at A16, it was one of my favorite things to eat there. And still today, if I have cannellini beans like these, if I'm eyeing these guys, I could just drain these. Within 5 minutes, I could have mashed cannellini bean deliciousness for lunch.
Well, that sounds delicious. And that actually answered one of our questions is could you puree the beans and put it on bread?
Oh, so that's a good question. I would say when you're talking about beans this gigantic, they're almost a little special. You can definitely do that. But if you're taking the trouble to find those larger style beans, they're almost creamy inside. It's great to just eat them as whole beans. But certainly for anything smaller, even these butter beans that are much, about half the size, those are delicious, creamy, because it's any kind of bean like Corona, cannellini, gigante. They have a creamy middle, and it just really plays well with a kind of mashed bean.
Yeah. But to your point, if you were cooking your own beans and you're not used to cooking and you overcook them, you could easily take the same recipe that you've just done and kind of do a chunky mash or a puree, right?
And I think the citrus zest, and that citrus zest could be anything from Buddha's hand, blood orange, lime. Let's see, today the sour orange, navel orange, Meyer lemon, Eureka lemon. I mean, really.
If you're willing to shave those little tiny.
Right.
So, are there any other fruits you might suggest or herbs that might be good in place of the zest?
I would say in place of zest, the thing about this recipe is it's sort of an evergreen one. You can serve this year round, and citrus, it's especially good in the winter because that's when you're getting the best citrus. And you don't have to worry about having fresh produce around to help with the beans, because the beans are already, they're cooked and dried or canned or however. So I would say that citrus zest is really, really great. This time of year with the fresh vegetables we're getting, I mean, you can definitely always easily go the Italian direction and add basil and tomato in place of the citrus. So I would think if you think of tomato as a fruit, which I guess it technically is, right, Ida? So you would probably use it, go that direction.
Oh, wonderful. We have a couple of questions that I'd like to bring up because I don't want to forget them, but there's a really great question from Farah Nesbitt. What is your favorite go-to quarantine meal to cook?
I've been on this, especially early on in quarantine. I was on this like oven roasting kick, and everything I used, I had like a spoonful of capers. I don't know, like it would be like cauliflower, and I would just chop the cauliflower up, rub it in a lot of olive oil. I guess there's a trend here with the olive oil now that I'm thinking about it. Roast it in a really hot oven with the convection on, if you have convection. I was putting it up to like 400, 450, sometimes 500, just to get a char on the cauliflower and get those capers to sort of bloom and get crispy. And the crispy capers, especially if you're cooking for vegans or vegetarians who don't eat fish, but you want that umami, there's something about a caper that brings that like ocean, seafood, salty umami flavor that I mean, it was getting a little ridiculous. I was putting capers in everything, and I was developing recipes for this cookbook. So I'm thinking, am I using capers in too many things? Because it's like, oh, I could make this caper oil. And just a quick tip, if you do like capers, getting a little pot with olive oil, getting some capers that you've drained and you've patted dry, you can fry the capers very simply, and they blossom and they get crispy, and you're left with an oil that has this nice caper flavor, and you're also left with this crispy capers that you can sprinkle on anything from roasted vegetables or pasta or
salad.
Salad, like any kind of thing where you need a little crunch, So capers were my friend. But that's not, so that was like the dish. I would just do iterations of something with capers. I've pushed myself away from it for a little bit, but that was definitely on my shopping list pretty much all the time, making sure I had capers.
Now I know what to get for you when we meet again. Another question is tasting food while blindfolded sounds like a great way to develop taste. What other exercises do you suggest to develop a palate?
I would say doing something as simple as writing down something that you tried that you really, really loved. It's something that people who write wine notes do kind of instinctively. For me, it doesn't come as instinctive, but sometimes you do eat something, or you have a combination of things, and it really sticks in your head. And just write it down, whether that's a note on your smartphone, or if it's you have a spreadsheet, or something that you can just say like peaches, lemon verbena, wow. That, you don't have to be long, but I think writing it down and documenting it so you can look back and say, okay, it's funny, I forgot that I had eaten such and such 6 months ago. Like I had forgotten that I was on this caper kick in March. But if you have kind of a document of like things that you don't have to write down everything you eat, or anything that you didn't, that was kind of forgettable. But anytime you have something that's very memorable, write it down. And anytime you have something that you just really couldn't stand, usually you don't have to write those down because you remember, but you can always write that down too. I don't know, Ida, do you have a system or a tracking way of figuring out what you've loved?
I have a notebook. that I keep, and it's like my inspiration. So I'll go back and say, oh, in 1992, I was really into, and then I can see all the different flavors. It's like, I think that time in the 90s, it was Szechuan peppercorns, and
Because you couldn't
nobody
get them
liked
here.
them, but now they're really hot. So I'm always a little ahead of the game in terms of what I like, but which is good and bad, but
it's true. It's like Chipotle. My mom grew up in Mexico City, and we always had Chipotle in the house, and then, but no one else ate it. It was like I don't know, just people didn't know about it at the time, unless you grew up with it. And then, of course, now there's the restaurant with the same name. But I remember there was a time, I think it was in the early 2000s, where Chipotle mayo was like on every single high-end fine dining restaurant. And the restaurant I was working at in Boston had to have a Chipotle mayo for their Cubano sandwich, which really didn't make sense at all culturally, but it had to have Chipotle mayo. So it's just, it's funny how trends like that. But I think that's great. Notebooks are such wonderful. I wish I had been more disciplined about continuing notebooks, like in journaling, and but it's when you can look back and think, oh my gosh, that's right. I remember when I was eating all these different braised greens, and why was I doing that? And maybe it was like a specific, sometimes you get involved, like you really love one recipe and you keep doing it over and over again and then iterating on it. That's another way to kind of build your palate. It's like, what did you like? If you make the same recipe multiple times, you can figure out what you liked more or maybe less each time you make it, and that's how you can also develop yourself as a cook, not just a great taster.
right. Oh, yeah. And that whole blindfolding and learning how to taste, once, your shelter in place is over, it would be a fun kind of fun experience with friends, like your porch club, right? Like,
right.
And also, while we're sheltering in place, for those of you who do have kids, this is a really fun way of teaching them their palates. I would say that you can start having your own gastronomy week in home, sheltering in place. I also want to ask you, before we have to kind of log off soon, what are the 3 recipes in the book that you think we should make? Because you've shown us the one that takes 30 seconds, but
which is not even a recipe. It's like a recipe, not a recipe.
Well, what are ones that might be a little bit more adventurous, or the ones that just really sparked your palate that you didn't think about?
If you like making jam, we made some very simple jams that don't require you to make a huge batch and then can it. You can just make a small batch of jam and store it in the fridge. And one of the flavors that I just really, really like is this special pear and fresh ginger jam. So you take pears and you shred them and you cook them with some fresh ginger and some sugar, and the flavors. I wasn't sure how I would feel about the jam at the end. And at first I'm like, oh, is this too sweet? Is this too, I don't know. But I thought it was just, it was the jam that I kept turning to in my refrigerator when I wanted, just something a little bit sweet on bread. And so I would definitely, if you have like more of a sweet tooth, I think in the French translation of sweet tooth is sweet beak, which I thought was kind of interesting. So I also think, if you're looking for something that's like a pantry-friendly recipe, you're just using what you have on hand. This dish right here, this is a pasta that is made with a cream sauce that you add a little cream, a can of anchovies, and you simmer it, and the anchovies break up in the sauce. Then you toss sort of spaghetti in this anchovy cream. You put an egg yolk on top, and you sprinkle hazelnuts on top. You didn't have hazelnuts, you could use other kinds of nuts. But this was a flavor combination that I would never come up with in a million years. And I was sort of like, is this going to work? And it really did work. I mean, that anchovy cream, even if you're not a big cream person or a big anchovy person, or you certainly don't think they should be together, it just works. It's very kind of savory but decadent flavor. And it's something that you really can make quickly with things that you might have on hand. So I would say that. And then I am a big fan of there's this recipe that she makes in the book from, let's see, oh, that was a dessert. I don't want to say a dessert. I should say something. I'll just tell you a story about a recipe that you may never make, but you just should know the story behind it. It's a chicken cooked in hay. And you literally take a chicken and you put it in a Dutch oven, like something like this pot up there. Mm-hmm. You make a nest of hay in the pot and you put a whole chicken in the pot, put water in it. You put the lid on and you let this chicken steam and get infused with the aromas of hay. This recipe was one that I think isn't going to be for everyone, but just the process of thinking through and figuring out how to make that in California. I have a friend who works at Omnivore Books in San Francisco, and she loves Paris, and she loved the idea of this recipe. And she also works with Quesa, the organization that runs the Ferry Plaza Farmers Market. And she said, I bet I can find a farmer who can get you hay. So every week I was sort of like, I thought, I guess not on the phone. I mean, who does that? Texting. And was asking like, so what's the status on, is Charlie going to be able to come through with the hay this week? And then she said, how much hay do you want? And I'm thinking, oh no, he's going to
get a whole
bale of hay. And I only need like a tiny bit for this pot. So, I ended up after the hay never arrived at the market at the right time when I needed to test the recipe. I went to a pet store and I bought organic hay for bunnies. And I checked to make sure it wasn't sprayed with anything and it would be fine with food, and it did work. So I was able to test that recipe for chicken and hay.
Well, thank you for sharing that, because I was just going to ask, where does one get hay to cook with?
I mean, it's crazy how simple the recipe is, but it's also just like, who cooks chicken and hay? But the story comes from a very famous French chef who has this iconic dish that was a chicken cooked in hay, and he did cook it in hay, but it was a little bit more elaborate. And she wanted something that was like her humble tribute to his creation. So even if you don't cook chicken and hay, it's a good story.
It's a great story, but it sounds like if we have a Dutch oven and can get to a PetSmart or something like that, you can
make it.
Also make it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, it looks like we're getting really close to our time together. I was just wondering if there might be any other questions from our audience. You can just put that into the comment. But again, I wanted to say thank you. Oh, there is a question. Do you have a favorite savory application for stone fruit?
And that's right, because we're thick in stone fruit season right now, at least in California. So you know what? If you are going to fire up the grill, grill your stone fruit. You could have a sauce that you brush on. It could be infused with garlic and maybe some fresh herbs. Thyme would be really lovely with peaches. And just roast them, grill them. It won't take long, and you'll have a sweet, savory kind of peach side dish. I would definitely sprinkle some sea salt. I do know a lot of people like to serve peaches instead of tomatoes for like a caprese salad. That's another thing you can do with a little bit on the more savory side.
And
vinegar that's a little
would be tasty on those too.
Oh, maybe, yeah. And I would say like a white balsamic vinegar on top for like a really light salad. White balsamic would be a little less intense, and it has sweetness, so it can be acidic without overwhelming the peach. And I think those two, the white balsamic peach, could make a great easy salad for sure. And that would work for plums as well, and other stone fruit.
Okay. All right. Here's the last question. And it's a pretty funny one. What is your cooking pet peeve?
Cooking pet peeve, like me with other people in the kitchen, or?
It's kind of open-ended. So how about?
Okay, so my cooking pet peeve. Well, when I'm looking at a recipe and there's too many pots and pans it's required to actually execute the recipe, that's a pet peeve of the recipe. A pet peeve in the kitchen, I think, is not cleaning up as you go. Ida, you probably have the same.
Yes.
Kind of, but it's like when someone does something in a kitchen and then wanders off and leaves a trail of glassware and plates and things. So cleaning as you go, and having a plan. I laugh because I love cooking with my mom, and we have totally different styles of cooking. So we've learned to work around each other, but sometimes she'll have the cutting board sort of askew on the counter. And I'm thinking, how do you chop when the cutting board's not straight, like positioned straight on the counter? Like, it just blows my mind. It's not a pet peeve. I just think, I'm like, why? And it's consistently at an angle. So everyone has their way.
Everybody has their own style, just like they have their own tastes, and should trust that, right?
Right.
So we are at time. Kate, I just want to thank you again for making this happen and joining us today. And if you're interested, please, find Kate's book at your local bookstore, and we look forward to your next cookbook.
It was a delight to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. And next time we'll cook in person, I hope.
Yes, that'd be lovely. Thanks. Take care.